Okay, so we're back at it, and this is just going to be the rest of classical economics, and if we have time, we'll circle back to Marx and then Keynes. But I didn't get a chance to get this in the first session, but Say's law is foundational. You hear the phrase supply-side economics, and of all the misunderstood ideas in the world, that is right up at the top. But Say's law is basically that supply creates its own demand. Supply creates its own demand. Now, this comes from an economist right after Adam Smith named Jean-Baptiste Say. You see the words there, Say's law. And I brought the atom back and the circular flow business over here, just representing supply. You notice I don't have the bottom part, just doing one thing here. Individuals or households. And you see in Adam's head 2.0. And that's going to wind up being the formal cause. Now, his end cause is the profit motive. However, the formal cause is this, what I'm going to call 2.0. He's convinced what Gilder called that golden rule of sharing by the profit motive, where you're producing something. But Say's law is important here because 2.0 can only come from this. And 2.0 meaning, like an iPhone or whatever the next thing is. Don't worry about that. It's just that's all it's representing. Gilder summarizes this idea of supply creating its own demand. He says, quote, capitalism consists of providing first and getting later. The demand is implicit in the supply. Now, if you say, no, it's not, because I just want money. I'm just greedy, and that's got to come from them, and I've got to trick them. Now, if you hate reality, that makes sense. But here's the news for you. Your problem is you hate reality. The reality is the 2.0 is only going to work if it works. And that doesn't come from the demand. That comes from the supply. There's all sorts of things you demand, but where's the supply? I demand to fly to the moon. Where's the supply? Okay, so the demand is implicit in the supply. It has to come from the formal cause of the mover, the actor, the entrepreneur. More technically, the theorem level of Say's law is that the sum of the wages, profits, and rents paid in manufacturing a good is sufficient to buy it. Okay, but this is the key to this shape I've been showing you. The expansive, the productive side of the economy is in the 2.0, in the supply. And that, when we looked at money last time, then money can correspond to the growth of the good. This is why zero sum is not real. It's not the real world. As long as humans are higher than animals, this is crucial to the Christian worldview. If you're a consistent Christian in your thinking, you will be able to make the transition to supply creates its own demand. It's just a function of the rational animal being above the cosmic machine, above nature. Okay? It comes from a formal cause, and everything good in economic life that follows from it follows from that. In other words, the whole economy, there's enough wealth to buy its products. And that wealth, that is wealth. That is what wealth production is. And the key to eliminating poverty is wealth, not to spread less of the wealth and eventually to spread the poverty. A couple of misunderstandings of Say's law, so we don't misunderstand what's being talked about. Say's law is not saying that all forms of supply therefore create themselves at every point or equally. Clearly, milk supplies do not increase because either the cows or even their farmers get some wild new idea for a brand new 2.0 of milk, for example, right out of the source. Instead, there are signals to suppliers from the price of cheese going up or ice cream sales to some new market. So this principle is a general principle. It's true. It's universal. However, don't misapply it and then attack that straw man. Even Marxism presupposes the truth of the supply side. Because guess what? Marx aims to seize the means of production. He doesn't attempt to seize the means of consumption or even the supply of money. Marxism is not particularly aimed at seizing the supply of laborers on the corner, because then they'd all have to work, including the good-for-nothing radical. Okay? They're after seizing the means of production, which tells you that they know that's where the engine is. So Marxism operates as it does on the assumption that their opponents are right. They just haven't thought through that. Now, conversely, leading with demand, the other way of looking at the world, contracts the economy. You're going to hear me refer to this, and if I forget, let me just say it now. Economic policies which cause funds or resources or incentives to flow to the less productive side of the economy. Okay? That's demand side economics, which we'll get to with Keynesianism. But it's really anything except for classical economics. But Gilder says in Wealth and Poverty, because there is no demand for new and unknown goods, no demand for the unforeseeable fruits of innovation and genius, preoccupation with demand fosters stagnation. If I don't start here and incentivize this on the grounds or because I'm motivated by pumping up this, regardless of who's buying nothing in particular, then I am merely, one way or another, I'm transferring things that already exist to less moving parts of the economy. Okay? So, and if I forget to say this, let me say it now. Reagan's law of government interference in an economy. He once said that government has 3 rules with respect to taxation and regulation in the economy. And it's this: if it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. If it stops moving, subsidize it. Now, A, that doesn't work for obvious reasons. Depends what you're trying to work on. B, it works magnificently if your goal is for the government to take over an economy and people's lives. So there's a little bit of cynicism, justly earned, in that law. Let's move on from Smith and Say to a couple of other guys. David Ricardo and comparative advantage. I talked about voluntary exchange on the individual level. I've talked about that happening because, and only because, both parties believe that they are gaining in the exchange. Well, Ricardo came up with an idea called comparative advantage. Comparative advantage. And here you don't just have 2 individuals. I'm just going to do something really cheesy. I'm going to draw England in some way. That's England. You're just going to have to trust me on that. Ireland's over here. Okay? And then France is over here. Just go with it. Spain's down there. It doesn't matter. Okay? That's England. That's Spain. Let's do a little UK, France. You're just going to have to trust me. Okay? And here, there's going to be an exchange of sorts. And at least this picture will set us up in a good way. In the system of free trade, a business or a nation will produce more of and consume less of a good for which they have a comparative advantage. Now, what is that advantage? It is an advantage over others in a sense. It is competition. We're not afraid of that word. And in that competition, one business or country, which is what we're looking at now, can produce a particular good at a lower cost. David Ricardo in 1817, in his on the principles of political economy and taxation, developed this piece of classical economic theory. And it is his original question that really interests us. This has a lot of applications, but we're just skimming the surface here to make the points. If my country, Britain for example, has sufficient division of labor, such that our workers can produce any and every good that we need, well then why on earth would we trade with other countries? So this is sort of, in addition to anything else, this is against protectionism. Well, first, consider how unequal any two countries will be in a great many particular goods, whether because they have some abundance of something, Idaho's got potatoes, or whether so if the states are trading, or because they have certain skill in some field, Silicon Valley's over there, whatever it is. There's going to be inequality between the two countries in any number of particular goods and services. Each country may reason that we can do it all overall, okay? But any 100 or more goods will inevitably be produced more naturally or for whatever reason, better or cheaper in the other country. France, in this case, the other country. Secondly, that being the case, each country will tend to increase its overall consumption of the imported good. I'm going to increase my consumption of the imported good by exporting the good for which it has a comparative advantage. So I have I'll just put comparative advantage over here and over here. This is France's comparative advantage. This is the UK's comparative advantage. Whatever it is, wine and cheese going one way and tea and toast going the other way. I'm just making stuff up. Why are we bringing this up? In addition, just, obviously we're saying, well, this is what we said about voluntary exchange of the individual. We're just applying it overall. One paradoxical result of allocation of resources by competition is that it actually dissolves human strife and dissension. And that may seem counterintuitive to you, but when the competition of consumers for basic needs is absorbed in a sea of sellers who are equally competing with each other, then the availability and the diversity of options increases. So you say, well, healthcare, education, medicine, I had another one, whatever it is. The people, this is important. It's not like burgers. People will just, the monopolies, I can't trust anybody, and we're all just going to be begging on soup lines. No, it's the other way around. Because those things are so important, there's going to be a sea of competitors making sure that these things happen because they will have an incentive to make money. And so they can do that in healthcare and education and so forth. You make homeschooling free and possible in a certain state, or if you just eradicate public school because you're afraid of a virus, just hypothetically. If you were to do that, an amazing supply of homeschooling resources will emerge, partly because people can make money off of it. So it's entirely the reverse about your fear about basic products. But anyway, because that availability and diversity of option increases, the consumer tends to see his fellows less as a rival. Likewise with commodities, because they're not going to the UN drop to fight over the bags of food that are the only thing in town that are coming at me. I don't even know where they come from. But now there's this glut of competitors on the market between which I can choose the products, and I'm not, clawing at my neighbor for those things. Likewise with the commodities. When the same material and methods are used, for example, for building houses of worship among Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, or the same profit motive exists for loggers to sell to lumber yards as to baseball bat or pencil manufacturers, well then, what tends to fade into the past are the former incentives of traditional rivals to compete by violent means. You see, there's going to be competition for resources either way. But without those market pressures and market forces and competition in that way, you have violent means of competition for the same opportunities and terrain and resources. Now, it is true, in capitalism, all such groups are still competing for resources. But the difference is now that such competition is regulated by voluntary processes rather than by violent ones. It's very crucial. The classical vision did not finally supplant mercantilism in Britain until the repeal of what were called the Corn Laws in 1846. These were a set of tariffs and other restrictions on imports like wheat and other agricultural commodities that just went under that general name. But it's exactly from this point in the 19th century that the British economy set its growth records. Public spending as a percentage of the British national income fell from 1/4 to 1/10 of national income by 1897. Just exploded. And invention, same thing in America as well, but invention that came from that, and peace, which we'll see in a second. Two other examples that Milton Friedman cites of the success of capitalism are the instant free trade in Japan after the Meiji Restoration of 1867, when they modernized and westernized, and then Hong Kong in the latter part of the 20th century. Now, by contrast, in America, we shot ourselves in the foot a couple times, and one example is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Bill of 1930 in the United States, and that's believed now to, even by some that are not typically free market economists, looking at that as one of the major causes of the Great Depression, and there were others. But again, there are political benefits from a harmony of interests here between countries, just like between individuals. It was said that the century from Waterloo to the First World War was one of the most peaceful in human history among Western nations, marred only by some minor wars, and that is the Crimean, the Franco-Prussian, and the U.S. Civil War. But besides those, it was an unprecedented era of peace. And it was because the emergence of this competition of resources that allowed people to dissolve the old form of rivalry to this newer, more peaceful form, where you had common interests. Ironically, competition in free markets creates common interests in a natural way, not a forced way. Okay, now there were bumps, glitches in the classical system because they weren't part of the classical system. For example, you'll see, Smith, Malthus, and Ricardo put in the same boat. Well, there's a misunderstanding here. Thomas Malthus, same time, roughly, as Ricardo, was a clergyman in England. He was conversant in the pre-Darwinian evolutionary fervor and worldview. His essay on the principle of population in 1798, so written before Ricardo, 20 years before, put the survival in the way that classical economics began to be strawmanned by its opponents as being basically Darwinian. As a nation's wealth increases, naturally, their food production increases, right? So this is Malthus's theory. Birth rates rise, because food production increases. Instead of growing toward investment, now this is right where he starts to go toward Keynes. And I know we haven't got to Keynes yet, but you're going to see that's not classical anymore. And if you're thinking that, that's right. That's what I want you to see. Food production increases, birth rates rise. Instead of growing toward investment in maintaining an increasing standard of living, an affluent society tends toward consumption. Now, of course, we would recognize that that's true, but he continues. The poor are left behind, and being more susceptible to famine and disease, not to mention having a higher percentage of children in the first place, then the population declines. And so Malthus sees a cycle. The cycle is inevitable, it's repeated, and behind this was an assumption. Quote, the power of population is indefinitely greater than the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man. What did he just say? He just said the opposite of Say's law. This is not classical economics at this point. Okay, what do we have here but a wrinkle on the zero-sum presupposition? It can't compete. The earth, the resources, the supply can't compete with this inevitable cycle and this incompetence in people to maintain savings, investment, and so forth over consumption. And so this raises the question as to whether Malthus ought to be considered a classical capitalist or a late mercantilist, a pessimist of that sort. Well, let's fast forward. We're going to leap over Marx and Keynes. We'll come back to them. But we just want to get to the rest of the classical vision, just to add a couple of last pieces. Neoclassical economics, let's just call it. And again, I've said this before, when you see classical liberal economics, a liberal economy, what they mean in those books written in the 20th century is laissez-faire, hands-off, free market economics. They don't mean liberal as it later became to mean a progressive or a socialist. 1940s and 50s, Friedrich A. Hayek and Ludwig von Mises came, and that's spelled M-I-S-E-S. I don't have my props. I should have brought some more props over here, but maybe I'll do that next time. They came out of what's called the Vienna Circle and formed the Austrian Economics School. And their great contribution against the backdrop of real fascism in Nazi Germany and communism in the Soviet Union and China and elsewhere was to draw out the links between economic freedom and political freedom. And we'll make more of that in future sessions. But another epicenter of the classical economic revival settled in at the University of Chicago. And one of its champions, Milton Friedman, puts the link between economic liberty and political liberty very concisely. Friedman says this, quote, "Wherever the state undertakes to control in detail the economic activities of its citizens, wherever that is detailed central economic planning reigns, there ordinary citizens are in political fetters, have a low standard of living, and have little power to control their own destiny." You know, one of the things I want to say, deviating from economics for a second, is whatever your issue, whether it's police brutality or whatever else, if you want to address it, one of my arguments to you would be sort of a baseline argument. You have to exist and not be in fear of your life and have freedom of speech and assembly first, as a precondition. So we can talk about all those other things, but unless you have that first, so your solution cannot be to eradicate the branch on which you're sitting on. We can't even have this conversation if it's forced at gunpoint. Okay, so you at the very least, you can't have a political and economic relationship in which you eradicate basic human freedoms. Okay, back to the price system though. Not only descriptive, we talked about that, but it's also normative. Price changes and comparisons signal to all relevant parties to adjust behavior. So here, relevant party is an individual calculating for his or her own ends, whether it's a household or a firm. Thomas Sowell explains, and we're going to focus on these guys now, and a group I have not put in there yet is government. So let's just put them in. Let's erase all of this. And we're going to compare an individual, not Adam this time, but one of these price checker thingies at Walmart, looking at the meat section and pricing the meat, for example, versus a bureaucratic elite class over 350 million people. Okay, so we're going to compare this guy and this guy, or guys. Sowell explains that while a free market economy or a free economic system is sometimes called a profit system, it is really a profit and loss system. And the losses are equally important for the efficiency of the economy because they tell the manufacturers what to stop producing. Without really knowing why consumers like one set of features rather than another, producers automatically produce more of what earns a profit and less of what is losing money. So they don't need to know everything. This guy doesn't need to know everything. He just needs to know what's relevant in his sphere, and he's interpreting the signals for that purpose. Now, this highlights two features of the free market that its critics wish to obscure. The free market, for this reason, is less autocratic. In other words, the greater majority has a maximal chance to choose. Secondly, it is least incompetent and careless. The lesson Gorbachev didn't understand when Thatcher brought him into the market. Those responding to the prices, signaling to them that production is a loser in this case, I've got to change behavior, are the ones that are most apt to change their behavior the fastest, not the bureaucrat. Let's set forth some principles in closing today as to why that is. And this is really one of the great articulations of the neoclassicalist school, whether it's the Austrian Economic School or Friedman or Sowell or anybody else. Two prerequisites for efficiency. Two prerequisites for efficiency. Here versus here, the bureaucratic elite versus the individual reading the price signals. You're going to read the price signals one way or another, but two reasons why the individual actor in his own sphere, minding his own business, does that infinitely superior. Two things. Number one, he has direct expertise in that activity. He has direct expertise in that activity. That is, the one most relevant to respond to price signals is the one who is most qualified and most interested in the subject matter of the exchange in question. Each individual actor has this in the many trillions of cases. Now, hold big numbers like that in your mind for a second. And the central planner has none of it. In any of the trillions of cases. I mean, to consider that one fact alone is why no reasonable mature adult can believe in central planning over a free market. And your failure to grasp that and the massive difference between that superiority and that thing that just makes no sense whatsoever proves that you either have never had a job, a real job, or else you're just so obsessed with your utopian vision that common sense eludes you. And that brings us to the second obvious fact, but not so obvious, is that this guy, unlike these guys, bear a direct cost for failure. Direct expertise and direct cost for failure. So again, the price checker who regulates all the prices and checks that for the competitor, maybe in some cases, not only has direct expertise, but bears direct cost for failure. In this case, maybe a supervisor. It is the entrepreneur who risks investment for profit, and it is the individual consumer or saver or investor who bears the cost for a purchase or foregoing of a purchase. The individual actor has this. The planner doesn't have this either. And so to review, the planner has neither direct expertise nor bears the direct cost for failure. That's why Hayek called the intellectuals those second-hand dealers in ideas. They lack these two. And put together, these two factors mean that the planner also lacks a third thing, and that is relative incentive to succeed. This plus this equals relative incentive to succeed. This is where the rubber meets the road on comparing the two different kinds of economies. And so accordingly, if you don't have these two things, it will also be more difficult to show how the planner has failed. I have no problem seeing how you failed if you had a crazy multi-marketing idea or I'm going to sell such and such. Okay, you want me to invest? I'll invest. I find out a couple weeks later it didn't pan out. I can see very clearly and in what ways you failed, that risk did not pan out. When I lack these two things, to that extent, it is more difficult to show how such a scheme failed, as he, the planner, unlike the rational actor, can hide his failure behind generalized platitudes and is not fired or left without his resources for his failure. His resources are your ever-flowing tax dollars, and his platitudes bypass the intellect to play on the heartstrings of the masses, of a population that no longer studies economics or civics. And so you have a law of unintended consequences, and this is the last thing I'll say about this, the law of unintended consequences at work. The classical economist need not insist that his opponent is positively wicked. He may be, but we don't need to even say that to bring out this reality. His opponent may be a true believer, the so-called bleeding heart liberal in the flesh. Nevertheless, he is committed to an illusion wrapped in slogans. Good intentions by themselves do not make good policy or analysis. This law of unintended consequences is exacerbated in direct proportion to two things. This is the last thing I'll say. In direct proportion to the expansiveness of the policy. So let's go over here now to the elite. The expansiveness of the policy over things. So I have a policy. There's going to be a law of unintended consequences. Which law will be exacerbated in direct proportion to two things? The amount of things my policy is over. And just like that lawnmower parable, the second thing, the amount of people over whom the law governs. And it's governing an incalculable field of activities and relations. Let me put it in another way. If these two factors are the nature of reality, then the more expansive the policy of central command over more people, the greater amount of static will be introduced into the natural order of price signaling and natural incentives. That's why it doesn't work. Now, there's a lot more that can be said. Some other tendencies I have written down here. Oh, yeah, about envy and so forth and so on. But we're going to wait for next time to talk about that. We'll bring in, that's a good place to do it. Without getting into the end of this, we'll insert Marx and Keynes, and then we'll bring back the empirical record, and we'll talk about some last insights we'll talk about supply side economics. And then we'll be ready, after introducing all this grammar and all this logic of it, we'll be ready to talk about the empirical record. So that's kind of what we'll do the next two sessions in wrapping up economics.